Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn Turkovich, the Executive Director of the Charter for Compassion. Welcome to our event today. We began a journey starting on January 10th in honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. King was a powerhouse for his time and beyond. He's one of the greatest intellectuals in American history, a man of substance and action. He understood how to bridge the depravities of poverty to the wealth of nations, and the struggle for freedom to the core of creating a beloved community. During this week, the Charter for Compassion has participated in events celebrating the extraordinary grassroots, national and global challenges that King has charged us to follow. We started in conversation with Dr. Clarence Jones, King's lawyer and speechwriter, as we uncovered missing pages of history. Yesterday, we reflected alongside Paul Chappell, founder of the Peace Literacy Project, on the efforts it takes to create a more peaceful and just world. Realizing the immensity of the task can feel overwhelming. We are turned upside down and feeling that another tragedy has happened to the people of the Ukraine. And in turn, that tragedy has left its mark and affected all of our lives. Today, we have with us Thomas Hübl. For most people, he needs little introduction. Thomas is a spiritual teacher, an individual who blends ancient traditions with contemporary science. We're honored to have him with us. His life is full, working with business leaders, organizations, consultants worldwide. Let me turn this over to Thomas in just a few seconds. But before I do, I'd like to say that Thomas's Pocket Project and the Charter for Compassion are coming together to offer a course, Trauma-Informed Leadership. It will start at the end of April and continue until September. We're just about ready to unveil the particulars of that course. If you are interested in participating in the course or learning more, please put your email address in the chat box anytime during this presentation, and we will be sure to get back to you in the next few weeks. Thomas, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you. Yes, a warm welcome from my side too. So first of all, of course, today I want to share more about my experience of the last 20 years working on mainly like individual, but also mainly collective trauma fields around the world. And at the beginning of our call, I just want to maybe take a few moments to honor and make a space for the fact that right now, like today between Russia and the Ukraine, like we see how trauma repeats itself and unresolved trauma repeats itself. And I don't want to just start with the call while we are kind of in the world in such a fresh situation as well. So I just want to hold a space for a moment for the fact that that suffering is happening right now too, and it's happening often around the world. That's true too. And I'm sure many of us are aware when we open the news today and in the last days what's happening, that we make a space for a moment to just see how we are related to the current events. That's just without any, okay, what's right or wrong, just to notice, because I think that's also already what I want to talk about today when we look at what's the effect of trauma, and trauma has become like a buzzword in the understanding of human pain and suffering. And I think it became a way of like a scientific and a modern expression of something that the wisdom traditions were talking about in a different form. And I want to relate these two today. But it starts with relating, like what's my relation to like traumatizing events? What's my relation to the world as such? And that we see that a lot of trauma is being inflicted out of inappropriate relations. Relation and relating is the main remedy. So that's the good news. On the other hand, trauma hurts our relational capacity. And so I want to speak about this today. And that's why I said I want also at the beginning of the talk that we just notice our relation to the current crisis in the Ukraine and Russia. And how, like, for example, for myself as somebody that was born in Europe, and in Europe, some decades after the Second World War ended, is like how also am I part, or my ancestors part of the current situation? I think that's an important question to ask, instead of just pointing outwards that the problem somehow is somewhere out there, but how are we all part of the recurrent effects of trauma? So I think that's an important question to ask today. And so I will speak a little bit, and then we can do a practice, and then I will continue. And then the last half an hour, it would be great if you have any questions that come up in you, or anything that my presentation will spark in you, that you will have some time for Q&A, so that's that more exchange is possible. Just for us to be on the same page, trauma, I frame trauma as a strongly overwhelming event that an individual or a society goes through. And that strong impact creates, on the one hand, a tremendous amount of stress and pain. Our nervous system developed over hundreds of thousands of years what we call the trauma response, which often leads to the fact that there's an internal fragmentation and a dissociation or a numbing. So one part of us becomes absent. And so there is hyperactivation, there's a lot of stress, and then there is numbness and absence, and in between is fragmentation. Or another word to describe fragmentation is to say the sense of feeling separate. So hyperactivation, separation, numbness. And I think these also describe already the three main sets of symptoms that trauma creates. And I'm saying this, I'm sure that many of us are aware what trauma is, but just that you know what I mean when I use the word trauma. And so it's the trauma response in me that usually, if it doesn't get resolved soon after the traumatic event, it kind of crystallizes and becomes more frozen or steady, and it becomes a chronic part of ourself. And in the so the symptoms are either hyperreactivity and over-exaggerated experiences of moments. Then there is fragmentation. Fragmentation creates two, me and them, us and them, the others, othering. And another function is when we become distant, when we don't feel, and sometimes when we hear about events that happen in the world, either we feel very triggered, but one way to feel triggered is to not feel at all. And I often say the strongest pain in our world is the pain that has no cameras. It's the pain that is mute. So there are mute parts in ourselves, maybe. And then there are mute parts in the cultural permafrost, like in the part of our society that is frozen, and where the pain of either our lifetime or our ancestors is like a permafrost in the culture. And within that permafrost, there's a lot of suffering and pain stored, but there's also a lot of learning stored that hasn't happened yet. So trauma integration is actually a very important win-win-win situation, because I stop keeping the trauma frozen, which uses up electricity, energy. When I digest the pain, I grow. My perspective on life gets bigger. My aliveness, my creativity, my capacity to relate and contribute to society is growing. And I harvest the learning that didn't happen yet because it was frozen in the ice of the past. So, and another thing that's very important for me is that the trauma response in itself, not the overwhelming experience, but the response that happens within us is a highly intelligent function. It saved us. And then when today we often say, oh, this is my weakness, and here I'm not good, or here I don't like myself, or here there's something wrong. When we look at it closer, we always find that a weakness is not a weakness, but is actually a very important function that is intelligent, that I developed because I needed to protect myself. So when we do trauma healing, we always, it's like an exploration of intelligence and developing a deeper listening to processes we don't understand. So what we might call dysfunctional here is functional somewhere else. And once I harvest the function, I can change my life today. So that's just a short overview over what is trauma. But today I want to look at, because trauma often is framed as a personal experience, a biographical experience, my attachment trauma, something happened to me, there was a car accident, or there were difficult experiences or abusive experiences that I went through. And that's certainly very important and true. And at the same time, what I found out through 20 years of work was what I also wrote in Healing Collective Trauma in my book, where I summarized this 20 years of work, is that it got more and more clear to me that we grew up in a world that has been traumatized for thousands of years. We all have been born into some sort of wounding or scars. So the water has a certain saturation of trauma that became so normal that we can't see it anymore. And that kind of trauma, that's what I call collective trauma, that the collective environment carries a certain amount of trauma that conditioned us as we grew up in it. And the reason why I think that's important is that might lead to the fact that we might say, oh, that's how life is. So when I grew up, and I know my grandparents experienced the Second World War, they got hurt in the Second World War, and then my parents expressed certain symptoms of that, and my grandparents did, and my teachers, and the social environment. But as a boy, nobody told me, oh, Thomas, this is a trauma symptom, this is this. And so I grew up and said, okay, that's how life is. People are overreactive, they get easily triggered. Some people are distant, some people don't feel or seem like they don't care, or whatever. This is the landscape. When in fact, now, many years later, I would say, wow, no, that's not how life is. That's how life is when it's hurt. And that's important. Let's say somebody has a huge wound on somewhere on the body or on the arm and constantly complains about life-threatening inflammations. So most probably would say, listen, I understand that that's difficult for you, but you need to go to a hospital and take care of your wound. As long as you don't take care of your big wound, you will constantly get infections that will become life-threatening maybe. And the same, I believe, is what we have to do with collective symptoms. So the Second World War, or slavery and racism, or any kind of genocide or dictatorship, or any kind of, or natural catastrophes, any kind of more massive impact that were overwhelming effects onto parts of the population or an entire population of a country or a subgroup of a population, create like a collective wound. And as the next generations, we grow up in that wound. And the wounded environment conditions our thinking, our feeling, our bodies, our ways to relate, our ways to create society, and also affects our level of compassion. When we say we feel closed, we feel distant, we can't put ourselves into the shoes of somebody else, there's a lot of blaming, there's a lot of othering. There are recurrent cycles of pain and suffering and inequality. That's where I think a new level of collective work needs to come into being. Because collective trauma cannot be met through, just through individual work. There's individual work I can do in order to become more resilient and become like an internal space that is less triggered and less activated by situations and trauma and challenges, and is more able to bring generosity to places. Because where there's trauma, there's scarcity, there's something is scarce. When we heal trauma, we create abundance. So there is a lack of, trauma always comes with a lack of something. It feels like a bottleneck. It feels there's not enough space, there's not enough love, there's not enough compassion or potential development or capacity to live and express oneself or freedom. Trauma healing makes us more generous, makes us more contributing, and makes our world space bigger. And in the wisdom, we could say wisdom, one definition of wisdom is the amount of world that I can include in the way I live. Growing wiser means that we can include more of the world in the way we live. We move, we think, we act, we decide, we relate. And that's amazing, because the more of world is separate from me, my world space becomes smaller. The more world not enmeshed, included and transcended. So the more world I can include, then my world space becomes richer. And I think that's amazing. And trauma healing and collective trauma healing reduces the separation, the othering, the us versus them, and creates more collaboration, reduces fragmentation, creates more interdependence. And so throughout the last 20 years, we developed like a way of working with trauma that I call IAC, individual, ancestral, and collective fluidity. or IAC TIP, trauma integration process. And why do I call it fluidity? Because when we see everywhere we find trauma, we also find a part of life is frozen. When we experience, for example, in our intimate relationships with our children, in our family, the same conversations again and again and again, these conversations are non-emergent. They are repetitive. They are often ending up in conflict. They feel more separate. They feel less caring, less warm. They're more distant and cold or exaggerated. So non-repetitive, like repetitive, non-emergent processes we see in individuals, we can see in ourselves sometimes the way we repeat certain patterns with people or in our life, or internal patterns that we care, or addictions, or any kind of repetitive non-emergent process. And so when we look at society, we might say, oh, the society that I see is happening now. And I would say no. When we look at society, part of society are emergent, relational, spontaneous or creative processes. That's life in presence. That's life that's happening now. Part of the societal process is frozen in time, is a hostage of time. That's the traumatized part of our society. That is non-relational. It's non-emergent, which means it's repetitive. It's often distant and colder. And I think if more and more people, more and more of us recognize these two different processes without calling the one or the other immediately wrong and try to deny it, but to bring more awareness and more curiosity to those processes, we will wake up together into another level of holding. That's what I often call collective competence building. To become a trauma-informed or trauma-integrating society, or a trauma-restorative society, we need skill building. It doesn't happen just by itself. So in what Marilyn mentioned at the beginning, the Pocket Project is our NGO. And through this NGO, we, for example, last year ran 23 labs that dealt with different topics: colonialism in Latin America, in Africa, racism in the US, the Middle Eastern conflict, the Second World War and the Holocaust, colonialism in Australia, or gender violence. And we are looking what is actually like a trauma-informed leadership, trauma-informed collective competence building, so that we can shift from traumatizing society slowly to trauma-aware and informed, to trauma integrating, to trauma restorative societies. And what that means is that the degree of fragmentation where we can find a society is either re-traumatizing, so it creates again and again and again fragmentation and trauma, or the degree of integration slowly becomes higher than the degree of the traumatization. So over time, that society starts to heal. And first, it heals a certain amount, but then it accelerates the healing into more and more. And when we look at it on a deeper level, we could say that underneath every trauma, there is an ethical restoration needed. Because trauma happened through a violation of an ethical code. Or often, and the rest, after we heal the trauma symptoms, or the PTSD, or the complex PTSD, there's another step, I believe, needed, and that's the restoration of the ethical code that led up to the traumatization. And that's true between people, the restorative process between people, between individuals, but that's also true between parts of our society, and that's also true between states and as a global humanity. So that ethical restoration, I believe, is the full illumination of the self-healing mechanism of the world. Because life wants to heal. I believe life wants to heal itself if it has the right conditions for it. But if we are fixated in a certain condition, so life can't heal itself. So we need to create the right circumstances for it. And I think that's our calling, to create that circumstance or the circumstances. So one way to define healing would be when trauma is reduced movement, and well-being, or when we say, wow, I am in a flow, I'm usually not describing my suffering. When I'm in a flow, it's flowing. It feels good. I feel happy. I feel creative. There's well-being. There's purpose. There's agency. But when we say we feel a bit more stuck or stagnant, then we're describing reduced movement. So there's movement and there's reduced movement. So restoring the original movement is one way to describe healing. Another one would be to be able to create the right environment for it. So when we are able to create the right environment for healing, the self-healing mechanism of life can activate itself again. And I believe we need collective spaces to harvest the principle of that the individual is always an individual expression of the whole. An individual is not a separate particle. It's an individuated aspect of the whole. And that interdependence is our power. I believe that's our healing power. And we have seen this over and over again, also in very large scale groups, where we brought many people together and did deep work. When individuals do deep work as representations of the whole, and the whole is the resonance body of the individual, and that becomes like a healing environment. So these are very powerful processes. And one more thing that I would love to bring in now, and then maybe we do a practice, and then I will add a few more things, that some people say history is what happened in the past. I would say no. Integrated history is presence. So integrated history is that which is looking, listening, and speaking right now. Unintegrated history is the past. When we look at what happens in the traumatic moment, there is a split, and the overwhelming experience is being postponed. In the wisdom traditions, karma, like one part of karma, is the postponing of experience. Trauma is the postponing. I can't compute it now. It's too overwhelming. I need to fragment the part, which is intelligent in that moment because it helps me to survive better, but it's being postponed. That creates the past. And it needs a future to resolve itself. A question and an answer. And from that moment on, time is split. Presence is split. And so, but integrated history is presence. That's all the achievements of humanity so far are looking right now, are here through all of us. So the disruptions, the integration, the healing, new disruptions, new challenges, all the resilience that they created is sitting here through all of us. So our bodies are, one could say my body is as old as it's written in my passport. Another version would be our bodies are hundreds of thousands of years old, and they contain the concentrated liquid of all of our ancestors until now. Imagine all your ancestors come to you and hand over a pearl to you and say, walk it with care and with agency and with creativity, and refine that biocomputer through your life even more. I believe all of us that are being alive right now have been handed over like that gem. It's this amazing achievement that life had. And it contains the potential and the strength of our ancestors. And of course, it also contains the trespasses, the perpetration, the wounding. And I think the after effects of that are our ability to respond, our responsibility. That's what's part of our purpose development, is to heal the portion and to transform that into love, compassion, relationality, clarity, wisdom, connectedness, unification. And so I would love for it not to be too long, just the exploration of trauma. Maybe we'll have a little bit of a practice. And then I will add a few more points, and then we can open up the lines for some Q&A. But let's also create a little bit of space, how all of that lands in you right now. And maybe we can take a moment to just make a screenshot of your inner experience right now. Once you have a first impression, we all have a very good friend, which is our breath. And since short after our birth, our breath was and is with us until this moment, which means through very difficult and very beautiful phases of our life, we were breathing. Which means that within our bodies and nervous systems, every level of development, we were breathing. That's why the breath has a very strong function. Contemplative practices to connect us to ourselves. You can maybe let your breath, and especially your exhalations, support you to drop a bit deeper into your body and to just notice your body sensations. If your body feels tight, expanded, stressed, relaxed. And at first, we want to pay attention to all the parts of the body that feel lively, that feel present, where we feel streaming, pulsing, tingling sensations. Just see if you can keep your attention for a few moments just on that. Even if thoughts appear, maybe there's tightness in your body, just stay with aliveness. while you're sitting quietly, there's a lot of aliveness in the body. And from that centeredness in sensations of aliveness or flow or streaming, presence, we can check in, okay, what's my current level of stress as I'm sitting here now? Maybe it's very low, 1 or 2, maybe it's 5 or 6, scale from 1 to 10. And you can just check, how stressed do I feel right now? Then in a soft way to embrace a bit the sensations of stress. Just bring attention to, without trying to get rid of it, do something with it. Just to feel and be aware of. And then there is to be connected to body presence. That's also the part of my nervous system where I get real access to my stress sensations. And I can connect to, for a moment, and check in what's your emotional experience right now. Can I name flavor of emotion? Do you feel a bit overwhelmed emotionally or a bit numb? And then I'm curious, as you feel your body and your emotions. So I feel my body. I'm aware that I feel my body. What is aware? What's the awareness in you? It is aware of perception. It is aware of information. Information flowing through your body. It's aware right now. Then as we are already in that more contemplative or reflective space, you can check in for yourself and you say, in the cultural space that I'm living in, that I bring my gifts into, that I participate in. This can be in your family, this can be in your workplace, this can be in the society. How do you notice the symptoms of trauma, meaning hyperreactivity, overreacting, high levels of stress, exaggerated emotional responses, fragmentation, separation, othering, where the other side of it is distancing, numbing, absencing, lack of care, lack of participation, lack of curiosity and creativity, lack of opportunity. So when, like, how do we become aware? How do we trauma informed or trauma aware? That we notice those symptoms or expressions of trauma more and more in ourselves, but also around us. Just the fact that we explore what is actually the larger collective trauma field that in your culture, so it's most probably we're here from around the world right now. What is the wound or the scar that you have been born into, pre-existed your life? And it was already inherent to your environment in which you grew up in. So we all have been conditioned by that. And at the same time, we can all bring inquiry, curiosity, and a kind of more consistent exploration. And more conscious awareness to it. So that I become more and more aware how that collective trauma field is active, or where it's frozen. And so I already become more trauma aware, or more trauma informed. Then we can again take a moment to feel our body well, maybe take some deeper breaths. And slowly open the eyes again if you had your eyes closed. So a few more things I want to add, maybe as inspiration for the exploration. We talked about like the repetitive nature, that when experience is trapped in time and space, like caught up in the past, it has a recurrent nature. It comes back again and again, either within us as thought patterns that come back, emotional patterns, chronic stress, physical sensations, relational patterns. So these are all expressions of the symptoms. That's not the trauma itself, but it's the waves that it creates on the surface. And the same is true for repetitive cultural patterns. So me noticing repetitive patterns is the beginning of noticing more and more the trauma symptoms. Me having a practice that I apply to be more able to notice trigger moments, to notice trauma symptoms that somebody else expresses, and I can more and more hold the space, either for myself, also for other people that get very hyperreactive or reactive or very stressed or scared. Because as Steve Porges in the polyvagal theory discovered that we have all this tremendous power when we are not so triggered, then we have this amazing power to co-regulate with each other. So I often use the example that, for example, when my daughter comes to me and says, "Daddy, Daddy, I'm so scared, I'm scared." And then I have two options to respond, well, maybe more, but I'm speaking now about two. I can say, "Yeah, don't be scared, everything is okay, there is nothing dangerous here." So what did I do? I devalued, don't be scared. Like I devalued the emotional experience. I met an emotional request with a rational answer. There is nothing dangerous here. So I actually created a gap. The other option would be I turn to my daughter when she comes, "Daddy, Daddy, I'm scared." I feel her. I feel that she's scared and a bit stressed. Say, "Yes, I feel that you are scared or stressed. Come to me. Come." So I create emotional synchronization. I value the fear. My nervous system starts to sync up with her nervous system. We create co-regulation. And then I bring in rational leadership and say, "Okay, let's have a look what's really happening." So I bring in the rational guidance or the parental guidance once I created the emotional resonance and closeness, because that creates co-regulation. And I think that kind of simple example that happens often in workplaces amongst grown-ups now, in workplaces that happens in other family situations or in societal situations. What space or generosity can we establish in ourselves to create that kind of co-regulative environments? Because that's basically what starts to transform the trauma rifts into a deeper level of relationality. The other part I think is very interesting is the word information. So what does it say? In form. I have a form, let's say of you, or when Marilyn spoke at the beginning, when I listen to her, she lives in my nervous system. The one that I see happens in my central nervous system. So there's in, and I have a form of the person that I speak to, or you have a form, if you listen to me right now, you have a Thomas in you. So the Thomas in you is how I inform you right now. And if I were to see you, so you inform me. So it's in formation. is a form of the other in ourselves. That's called intimacy. So the deeper we are being informed by one another, which means we can feel each other physically, emotionally, we can join a mental space together, we are in a relational space together. The information is just deeper and deeper. So the intimacy and the closeness or togetherness is stronger. Where we are traumatized, the information gets disturbed because it hits a frozen land. So the seeds can go in, the information gets blocked. I often say, when it snows and the snowflakes drop into the river, they become water. When it snows and the snowflakes fall onto an iced over river, they pile up. So when experience meets an open nervous system, it becomes flow. Iced over river. The flow-up experiences are being experienced as difficult. So the pile-up can't be processed fully. So when we don't hear each other, because there are trauma layers in between, the information doesn't go in, or only to a certain extent. So we are still mentally talking to each other, but we can't feel what we are talking. So when there is a war happening right now, or when there is racism happening in our society, it's to be able to feel is reduced, and there's a tremendous impact. So for us to become witnesses, or true witnesses, as much as we have the capacity, and especially when we are not directly impacted right now in this moment, we participate in every life situation that we know about. It has something to do with us because we know about it. The fact that many of us walk around with a global information technology makes us global citizens. That means that once I read something, I'm part of it because I know about it. So it starts to inform me, but how deeply it informs me and how deep it activates my care, my compassion, and my participation, and my willingness, my agency, that depends on the level of information. Inform. And that's a challenging process because information comes often when I hear about something painful, it transmits also the painful part of it. And are we willing to share with each other, be willing to feel some of that pain in order to stay in the intimacy of the event? And so that information is often reduced because when we are hurt, then our bodies, our emotions, and our minds are not anymore one flow through the nervous system. The fragment flows. And the last part I want to speak to is, and then I would love to open it up for any kind of questions or statements. The last part I want to speak to is that the focus of our attention usually goes to 2 out of 3 aspects of life. So one is flow. When something is flowing in us, or part of our life is in a flow, it feels pleasant. It feels good. When we are creative and we have a sense of agency, we have a feeling, wow, I can contribute something, it makes us happy. So either my attention goes to that, or because it has lots of energy, because energy is moving, it's flowing, information is flowing. When my attention also goes to exaggerated information. So when something is exaggerated or somebody overreacts, somebody gets really scared or hysteric or gets very angry or dramatic, wow, it was very stressed, it attracts our attention. Why? Because it's an exaggerated information. But where our energy doesn't go so easily is the part of life that is absent. Absence doesn't scream. And when we look in the trauma escalation, the highest pain is mute. When somebody is deeply hurt, often people become mute or frozen. And I believe for every one of us that have the privilege and the luxury to have a deeper practice, a deeper awareness practice, with deeper awareness comes a higher sense of the ability to respond, response ability. And with that also comes a higher capacity to recognize the systemically relevant information that is absent. Because the first two that I said will attract our attention. The last one is designed not to attract it. The unconscious information that is not easily recognizable. And I think that that's the highest escalated stress in the system. Systemically relevant information that is not visible because it's mute. And it can't scream because it has no word. It can't ask for help. And that's why I think that us recognizing the absent aspect of life in ourselves, when I feel numb suddenly, when I don't feel, that I honor that because I know that I touch an overwhelmed part in myself. When I speak to somebody and the person is numb or doesn't feel him or herself, and I recognize it, that I take a breath, I create a little bit of space, I allow the system to digest information because the system is already overwhelmed. So to create an awareness for individual, relational, and also collective absence. Because absence is a non-caring space. It's a space where what we call the lack of compassion. That's the absence part of trauma. And if you want to increase compassion, what is I feel something. I feel that I even feel that I don't feel. I feel that you don't feel. That's why I can hold a space for it. I don't create more stress on you. I actually allow more space, a breath, a second or two, so that the processor can process the information and come back online. So recognizing that which is systemically relevant because it affects our life, absence affects our life, but it's not visible, it's not feelable. And I think for everybody that affects life, that facilitates processes, that contributes to society, that we increase our capacity to notice absence is a blessing. It's a very powerful human capacity, and that we don't wrong the absence, because when somebody, or when we ourselves touch mute places, frozen places inside, where we can't say anything, that needs love. That doesn't need more judgment. But often we are judgmental about those places in ourselves and also in others because it seems like it's not working. When something is not working, the fact that it's not working means something is working that it's not working, which means numbing. And I'm numb, then numbing is a process of not feeling. Otherwise, our natural state is that we feel. And that's why increasing our awareness of absence is very important, because the other two, flow and hyperactivation, are much more obvious. They are much more in our face. And the three of all of that together, I think, is part of a trauma-informed skill set, and also collective absence. That's where the real social issues are, that also don't activate the contribution that's needed in the society to take care of it. So they stay repetitive because we don't feel in these places. So with that, I would love to maybe see if we can transition to a maybe more of an exchange, or if some questions came in through the Q&A box.
A number of them did, Thomas. And there are a number of comments that are actually questions as well in the chat. So I'm going to move back and forth between the two. The first one that comes to you is from Sue. Would it be helpful to look at Russia's quest for power and control over Ukraine as a trauma response? How might we work together to relieve Russia of its aggression?
Yeah, for sure. Like, in a way, when there is a strong need for security, it also means that a certain level of security has been hurt. And so whenever we have that drive, that we need to create more security, it means that something has been hurt. And when we look at the history of Europe, and when we look at the history of the Second World War and the tremendous atrocities that also happened in Russia within the Second World War, and also after that, like the East-West separation. So there is a lot of traumatization that is still unprocessed. And we have seen this also on a smaller scale, just in the integration process. For example, we had some collective trauma integration processes around the East-West integration in Germany after the Berlin Wall came down, and when we did our work in Germany. And it's very strong to see how much work is needed to really create a common ground when we don't want to stay in the physical and emotional hurt and in the rationalization of the situation, where we say, yeah, we understand, and we are in our mental capacity. Of course we understand, but it doesn't mean that it's healed in the humanity, in the relational dimension. And so, that's why I think, like, that we first of all collectively notice that there is trauma at work, and that we created millions of people of awareness of that trauma. That would definitely make a big difference in creating another level of safety. But what easily happens is that situations like now just create a much stronger separation, and us versus them.
Okay.
Say something, Merlin?
No, I didn't say anything. You froze for a moment or two.
But because my internet connection not so good?
It's happened a couple times, but this was the first time I think you just totally froze. but we
Okay.
heard a good amount of what your response.
Okay, good.
I think what we'll do is we'll move on to the second question. And how can meditation have a positive effect on the current situation on Ukraine? Do you recommend sitting in stillness with the intention for people, or better meditate without intention? What else can ordinary people contribute now?
Yes, I believe that right now we need two things combined. We need, like when we talk about meditation, we often talk about spaciousness and creating like a kind of a more resting, deeper, silent, witnessing space. So we definitely need that. At the same time, when you just read the news, and however is there, I'm not saying anything about journalism and about what kind of information we consume. That's too big of a discussion now. But when you just connect internally to what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia right now, that's an example that's true for every other incident in the world too. So then I believe our bodies, nervous systems, emotional systems are very, very fine, can be very fine-tuned and perceptive. So when you set the intention to connect to the situation, there are things that you start to feel, and that we are willing to notice what we start to feel. We have a practice that we call global social witnessing, and it's a practice that we relate, for example, to situations like that. And then we see how much can I be a contemporary witness, which means I'm being informed physically, emotionally, mentally, relationally, spiritually. And where does my capacity to represent the situation end? And it's not that it shouldn't end somewhere. It will naturally hit a limit in myself, but that I increase my awareness of the limit where actually it's too much for me to be a full witness to what's happening because it's an overwhelming situation. And creating that kind of awareness, that's what I would call like embodied contemplative practice, that I have the witnessing capacity, but I am also, through my body, more and more related to the events that are happening in the world. And I think the combination of these two is very powerful. And the third thing is that in every one of us, something will come up. Either there will be grief, there will be fear, there will be maybe numbness, there will be something, anger. And that when we stay mindful to what comes up and not wrong it immediately, oh, I shouldn't be like this, I just should be in love, like send love or compassion, but stuff comes up in us. And that's also connected potentially to the trauma field that our ancestors and we are part of. So that things come up in us and that we make a space for that and don't shut it down immediately, but let it be, but consciously, not drown in it either, but consciously stay present to it. That's, I believe, also like a detox mechanism of life where I can feel the resonances that I have in myself with that traumatization. And I believe today in the morning, most probably millions of people, consciously or unconsciously, in Europe will feel the ripple effects of World War II mm-hmm. in their individual and collective psyche.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Thomas. There is a reflection and a question in the chat box. The practice that you conducted was beautiful. I'm noticing that I flip back and forth between being hyperactivated or distracted and numb regarding the events in our world. How can I move out of the trauma response and be more effective in the world?
Right. first of all, that we do not wrong the experience that is present. So when you sometimes feel hyperactivated, when you sometimes feel distracted, or also in contemplation or meditation feel distracted, that's not the wrong thing, that's something to be explored. So that's important. We're always looking at human intelligence, and that if symptoms are there, they're there for a reason. And we want to get, of course, we want to get deeper to the root of that reason, and don't stay in the, I often say, we can carve together in the smoke, or we can find the fire. So of course we want to find the fire and take care of it, but this doesn't mean that the smoke is wrong. So that's very important, because that immediately changes the way I approach myself. So either I approach myself in a way that I want to take care of what's wrong, or I want to find out more, and like that begin to re-own or get in touch with, or start to feel again. So that's very important. And the second part, of course, yes, we want to train when we feel okay, we feel more stress or hyperactivation. We want to learn, how can I practice, on the one hand, embodiment practices, and use my breath to. So what we did at the beginning, in the middle of the practice, was I asked you, okay, connect to your body sensations. So you connect to your physical body, you feel the physical body, and that's the level from which you can connect to your stress. Sometimes, because stress is an energy that goes up, we start to think more, we want to be active, we want to resolve problems. So the energy of stress goes up, the energy of relaxation goes down. So many contemplative practices are, how can I bring my activation, regulate my activation, so that I'm entering a state of reflection, digestion, integration. That is the power of space. I can reflect on my life, I can digest my experience, and I can integrate my experience as learning. But when I'm too stressed, there is no digestion. That's why we have digestive issues often when there's chronic stress. But it's also psychologically, we can't digest our experiences. So that's why when I'm in my thinking mind, when the energy is here and where I'm trying to think, it's very hard to do stress regulation, because I'm not in the right department of my building. So then my breathing can help me to slowly, sometimes even when I slow down my exhalations, that it helps me to connect to my physical sensations. I feel my hands, I feel the movement in my hands or my legs, my belly. And from there, I connect to stress, and I bring some softness to it. Because the mental activation, when also in contemplative practices, when people want to calm their mind, there's no way to calm the mind, because that's also just a symptom. The mind is like windmills. But what really turns the windmills is the wind. When there is no wind, there's no movement. When there is stress in the system, conscious or unconscious stress, we are overthinking. And then in meditation, I can't calm my mind because I'm dealing with the thinking, not with the stress. If I can connect to the stress and feel the stress as a physical sensation, and I learn to slowly down-regulate my stress, step by step, because I'm willing to feel it, be with it, and let it slowly relax. That helps me to calm my mind. Then my mind will naturally go more quiet. And the second important thing is, sometimes we do really need relation that helps us to co-regulate the stress. So sometimes when something is too upsetting or too stressful or activating, then talking to somebody that really holds a space or wants to be there and wants to be supportive and feels me, I feel you feeling me, is a tremendous remedy for hyperactivation. And so creating an environment where that happens more, I feel you feeling me, feeling felt creates safety, and safety creates down-regulation of stress. So that's something that we all need, but that's also something that we all more or less can provide, that sense of safety.
Thank you. There is a comment here from Terry, and she says, Thomas, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend Sadhguru's new book called Karma. To me, it aligns perfectly with your notion of trauma and karma being the same thing, even though he only once uses the word trauma. He defines karma as the conditioning both at individual, ancestral, and collective levels, which impacts how we think, feel, and behave. There's even a section called collective karma. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
No, I'm very happy to hear that. I think that's totally true. I'm very much supportive of that fact. And that's also very much how I look at it. Yeah, beautiful. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, here's another reflection. Hi, Thomas. I'm hearing many principles of what you're describing based in Hillinger's work stemming from indigenous tradition. Are you familiar with Bert Hillinger and applying some steps in that process to this collective group work? That's from Jahala.
Yeah, I'm definitely I'm familiar with Bert Hellinger's approach and work, which I highly appreciate. We don't do, like, there are many people within our communities and Sangha that are practicing family constellations. I don't do it, but I think it's a very good approach, and the systemic thinking is very beautiful. And I often say Bert Hellinger, like, through family constellation, put in a way like the dust into, like a magic dust into the room to make some invisible, what I call often subtle energetic dimensions more visible. And I think family constellation is definitely one medium or one tool that does that. And if it's well done, so then I think it's a great tool. Yes.
Okay. From Monica, today I felt echoes of my personal trauma, the echo that speak about a divisive nature being born in Colombia. During the meditation, I reconnected to the urge I feel about regulating my body. So the echo is not out there looking for blame, but embracing my own divisiveness from within. The question is, at a collective level, would this translate as my being in presence, I could echo less divisiveness to the surroundings?
That's right. That's right. That on the one hand, that, like, the practice in a way is that we do enough work that we can host more of the experience and less externalize the experience, which doesn't mean that we are not responsive to what's happening around us. We're even more responding to it, but we are less externalizing split of internal aspects of ourselves and then seeing that on others. So this re-owning and less divisiveness, more inner coherence, creates like an inner space in the individual that can host more of the world. That's fantastic. The more we do this individual healing work, we will see that some of the individual healing work will need an expansion. It's like when the cup is full, if I were to pour water into this bottle and I pour more and more, there will be a stage where it overflows. So when there is enough, because healing creates more abundance and trauma creates a lack of, there's not enough. So when we heal the trauma, there's more enoughness, and then there's an overflowing. So then my own healing starts to ripple back into my ancestral lineage. So my healing is actually a domino effect into the future generations. That's why it's also sustainable towards the future, and it's sustainability or healing that ripples back into the past. And so when more ancestral healing is included in my personal healing work, I ground myself even deeper. And then I include more collective aspects, but it's very important that we start with the innermost circle of intimacy, like the personal aspect, and then expand it, because otherwise there's a lot of either bypassing, or there's a lot of confusion sometimes what is personal and what is collective. So it's important to do it in a kind of a sequencing that helps us to approach it with more clarity. And yes, and when we apply the similar principles in group processes, so we brought together very large groups of people that did collective presencing and of collective issues, and that's very powerful. If we as collectives start to re-own our fragmentation and not externalize it, that's a very powerful thing. And I think that's the healing of the future. We will see more and more collective healing processes in the world. And it doesn't mean that we don't do individual healing work anymore, the opposite. But I think we are transitioning into a collective healing phase. And I think the very technology that we are using right now, like technology, is going to be a part of creating that kind of collective coherence building.
I'm going to apologize to everyone out there. There are so many questions that we are not going to be able to get to them all, but I've been trying to take them in order. So I am going to give you the next one. Thomas, can you speak about participating in healing collective trauma while also working on healing my own? What does walking forever look like in that situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I often say, and that's, I think, important for the spiritual journey, is that there are two different, let's say, fuel systems. One is based on fear and stress, and the other one is based on a calling, on purpose, and on the creative flow. So the creative flow and the calling is basically, that's the main fuel for our journey. The fear and the stress create a sense that I need to be faster than I am. I need to be more developed than I am. I need to be more in life than I am. And that's a sign that it's hard for me to be here where I am. So a lot of presencing allows us to be more the ones that we are, not the ones that we should be, that we could be, that we ideally could be. And so for the spiritual journey, it's very important to discern these two fuel systems, to say, yes, there is fear and stress. And that's what through my journey, I onboard more and more. And at the same time, I wanna walk my path more and more out of the real fuel, because that's sustainable. And that also means, because when even my mortality, that my life will end, if that's dictating my spiritual journey, that I need to get it done in this life. So I am in a hurry. And if I'm in a hurry, you might become my obstacle to get there. Or my work might become an obstacle, or people that I need to be with become an obstacle, and or being a parent becomes an obstacle, or social issues become an obstacle. So my capacity to love and to truly be with what is the current process is getting reduced. The more I'm in a hurry, the less I am in love with what is here. That's why I often say, if the walking becomes the path, so walking forever means that I have time for now. It's like the spiritual journey is not like a marathon. I will practice a lot, but then I want to get there. That's a big illusion. That's the forward projection of our mortality onto our path, and also onto the divine or onto the absolute. And so that's important. Maybe not everybody knows what's being meant with walking forever. I often say, when I walk forever, I have time for this moment. I can be truly in this moment because this moment is my walking. And it also means that the problems and difficulties that we have in our life are not blocking our way, they are our way. So if I say, oh, if I just hadn't this fear or this part or this numbness, or I should be more developed than I am, and I'm still having this pattern, these are all signs of trauma. I still have to deal with this pattern. Now I'm going to therapy already 3 years and I still have it. That still is the avoidance of what I really want to look at. And so that's very important. And the other part is, we need a certain level of individual stability or integration to participate more actively in collective trauma healing. But I think there's a level of integration where we do both in parallel. But if I feel that the collective trauma work is too upsetting, too triggering, too activating for me, then it's very good to first focus on the what I call to create more inner soil, earth, grounding, that allows me to have enough fertile ground to deal with bigger trauma fields. But eventually, from a certain level of integration, they are happening usually simultaneously, or they support each other, of course.
I just want to remind people, if you are interested in the class that's coming up at the end of April, please drop your name, email address in the chat box. I think that we probably have time for one more question, and I fear that it's going to take more than the time we have. Each of the ones that are left here will require a good amount of time. But is it wise to focus only on the oppressed in Ukraine without focusing on the oppressors in Russia? Aren't they equal and opposite parts of the same whole?
Yeah, that's exactly what, very true. I think that's exactly what we need to do, is that we notice the division in ourselves that the external situation creates, and how can we hold a space for both, and notice, when we look through the trauma lens now, when we how we hold a space for both, and we recognize. And I said, sometimes, like in the cynical modern time, we could say, yeah, these things are not so powerful, and they don't have a social impact, and so we need other things to do. But if what we are saying right now will be done by millions of people, it has a completely different impact. Not to go into this internal division, but hold a space for the fragmentation that is there, is a very powerful intervention. And if we can bring that into, for example, mediation work, and if we can bring that in already much earlier in the process into mediation work, then I think that these are very powerful interventions. And the collective, that's why I said we are, like, our mission also with the Pocket Project is to create that collective competence building. Because like I often compare this with when you, most probably in every country, but in many countries, when you do your driver's license, you need to take a first aid course. So when I worked while I studied medicine, when I worked as a paramedic, I trained, like I ran these courses for people that, learned basic first aid. And I thought, wow, that's a lovely analogy, that we all in this society can have a basic collective, individual and collective trauma knowledge that doesn't require of us to be like a very, trained complex trauma therapist, but we can all do the interventions that are needed on a certain level that will be very powerful. When we do that collectively, it will save lives. And I think in the trauma field, it will literally save lives. It's true.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And thank you, everyone. Your questions are incredible. And I'm so sorry we didn't get to every single reflection and question. We are hoping that we will be able, obviously, to do this in the future. We're twisting Thomas's arm a little bit to have him join our global read. So I'm doing that in public so he can consider that. And so also the class, as I said, if you're interested, we will send you the syllabus. We're still working on some of the finer details. Again, thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here and for being able to contribute to this space. And thank you for creating that space.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. Bye, everyone.